Hey, welcome into the REVO Church Podcast. I'm Jamie. I'm the host of the podcast, and I'm glad you clicked on this episode because here's the deal. I'm with Matthew. He's the co-host of the 21 Days of Actually, he was the host of the 21 Days of Prayer podcast. I don't even want to call him a co-host. He did the legwork, and man, I just got to say on record, I thought it was amazing. So,
well, I think that the YouTube views show that people at least enjoyed it. There was more than 2 people that watched it, me and you. And so if there was
more
3,
than me and you watched it,
if there was 3 or more, then it was a success. And
where 3 or more are gathered together.
Yeah, I think it's actually 2, but because it's you and I, that, we knew we were going to watch the videos. And so,
but hey, I'm joined with Matthew because here's the deal. About 5 months ago, if you guys remember, if you've been tuning into the podcast for a while, we dropped an episode called Confronting Sin. It was something that we sat down, we talked about, we were studying our Bible, and we saw in Matthew where it talks about how we are called to confront sin in other people, how we are called to go and stand up. And so we did a whole episode talking about confronting sin. And we were like, hey, maybe somebody will get blessed by it. And then we looked at the views and people were watching it. More than 2 people.
Speaking of YouTube views,
speaking
there was
of
a
YouTube.
lot more than 2 people.
And so we sat down and said, well, now that we're casting in this new season of podcast, what is something we could talk about? And we sat down and said, well, people were watching the Confronting Sin. So maybe you're looking at your family and being like, I got a bunch of sinners in my family and I got to hit them. But maybe you're sitting there and you're like, this is starting to call me out a little bit. This is starting to hit me. So today, as you know from the title, we're going to be talking about moral failures. We're going to be talking about what it looks like when you sin, when you actually cross that threshold. So Matthew, just give us a little brief, like when we're saying moral failures, like what are we talking about here?
We have moral failures all the time. And so we're not saying any sin in every sin, because that's constant. We're in a state of that for sometimes hours at a time if we're like constantly being angry, something like that. What we're talking about today are the big life upending, life altering, relationship breaking, those type of failures, those type of sins where you make such a big mistake that it's not something tiny and small with some repercussions, but we're talking about ripple effects, things that you want to live your whole life without ever doing this.
Yeah, this is
that sort of failure, that sort of sin.
Yeah, this is something we're not speaking directly on the idea of like you tell a lie.
Right.
Because that is an issue and that is sinful and that is wrong. We're not talking about you tell a lie. We're talking more about the sin that is a breaker. We're talking about a sin that will take you out. And so when we're looking at this, we're looking at the sins that we're pastors, we'll be honest. These are the sins, the moral failures that cost pastors their jobs.
Yeah.
These are the sins that cost people relationships. These are the things that break families, that cause split households, that do all of these things.
And can even put you in jail. I mean, some of them, are wrong in the Bible and wrong legally and will have you end up in prison. So,
they're not even just like there's a spiritual wrongness, but also there's just that moral failure, that legal failure of you commit these things. And so
these are all sorts, big umbrella of the big things.
Yeah, and so when we're looking at this idea, we're like, man, these are the things, like you said, that we do not want to commit. Like we do not, as believers, we want to stay as far away from that as we can. And so I think when we're talking about that, one thing that I think really helps us understand that more fully is what I love about the Bible is it gives us so many examples. Sometimes it gives us examples that, man, you want to follow them. I think about like Paul says, imitate me as I'm imitating Christ, right? Like these are the examples that you want to be like. But man, the Bible gives us a lot of examples. Like one of them it gives us is Adam and Eve. Adam and Eve in the garden, they're walking with God and then they have this moral failure where God told them, you can do, and I'm paraphrasing, God essentially said, you can do anything in the garden. Don't eat from the one tree. Anything else. And then they went and they followed and then they ate from the one tree. And from that moral failure, man, sin entered the world.
Yeah, I mean, you want to talk about a mistake that had a lot of major repercussions. That's one of them.
Destroyed.
Yeah.
We have stories like David and Bathsheba.
Yep.
Man, David was King David. He was he was Goliath killing David, Saul sparing David.
Yeah.
He was David that was anointed shepherd boy, moved to king, most powerful king, known as the man after God's own heart, David. And then what'd he do?
He had this huge moral failure, major mistake. Failure. And there were consequences because of it. And not just simple things, but a child died because of this moral failure. Like there's things that we have in our life sometimes where we make a mistake and something small happens. And that's, all right, like I made a mistake. I got a speeding ticket. Now I've got to do defensive driving or whatever. And that's no fun. It might cost some money or some time. But then there's other things where like life or death, major relationship breaking, costs you a lot of money, all this kind of stuff that's like huge. And David and Bathsheba is one of them. Cain and Abel is right after Adam and Eve. And honestly, you could say Adam and Eve, they're the reason that all the other things happen because of that one sin, right? We're going to be talking about one in Exodus, but there's another one in Exodus too.
Yeah, there's one before the one that we are diving deep into. You have the one in Exodus of Moses.
Yeah.
Moses is following God, doing everything God says. The people are disobeying. We're going to dive into the people, but Moses is following God. He's told to speak to the rock, and the rock will give water. Moses, out of frustration, strikes the rock. And guess what? That looks so insignificant to
I'm going to
us.
fact check myself. I'm pretty sure that's Numbers. It might be in Exodus as well. It might be told in two places, but I think that's also in Numbers.
That might be in Numbers, the exact. But either way, it's the same people.
Same story. Same timeline. Yep.
And he strikes the rock, and because of that failure of God said this, he did that, that caused Moses, who was with the people the entire time they were in the Exodus, to not be able to go into the promised land. Moses took them out of Egypt. Moses dealt with their grumbling. Moses dealt with the hardships. Moses dealt with every issue. And yet, because of that failure, Moses was not able to enter the promised land.
Yep.
And so we see this,
angry and
just boom, in one fell swoop, everything that he had been working for, gone.
Yep.
Everything that he had been striving for, gone. He was the last of that generation, and the next generation came in. And so when we're talking about these things, man, it's so just challenging. And so set us up, Matthew. We're going to be talking about Exodus 32. Give us a little like idea of why we're talking about Exodus 32 here.
Yeah. Mainly because it's in the Bible.
Amen.
Secondly, because I think it's going to be really helpful for those of us to see a warning sign and then prevent the major mess up, the major fall, the thing that ruins families and has all those negative consequences we talked about. But also because of the exact situation that they're in. So we're going to read it. If you've got a Bible and you're watching the video, like open it up if you want to. We'll read through it as we go. But what Exodus 32 is it's the story of the people and Moses and Aaron. The Israelite people are in the wilderness making their way to the promised land. Yeah. And they stop at one point. Moses goes up on the mountain with God, gets the 10 Commandments written on a tablet by the finger of God, all those sorts of stories that we know. And while he's up there, Exodus 32 happens, where the people build an altar and a false god, a golden calf. So if you've ever heard of that, maybe that's used even in popular culture too. That's not even have any spiritual stuff. So maybe you've heard of that and don't know where it's from. Here, Exodus 32. The golden calf, where the Israelite people worship it, and there's huge consequences because of it. This is thought of as one of the biggest failures. I mean, we think about like crossing the Red Sea, God providing manna and quail in the wilderness, God providing water when they needed. All these like miraculous things happen, and yet they still do this incredibly big mistake.
What really blows my mind before we read it is that they are surrounded by this mountain. They have been told that if anything touches this mountain that's not Moses or Aaron or some of the elders that were permitted to go up a part of the way to the mountain, if anything, beast or bird or person touch the mountain, they're going to die because it is the presence of the Lord. They can look and see the fire and the smoke of the presence of the Lord around them at that mountain. They can hear the thundering of the Lord at that mountain. They can literally, it's not just that they saw God moving. It's not just that they crossed the Red Sea, saw the plagues. It's not just that they saw God's hand. They literally saw God.
Mm-hmm.
Like they could physically see him. And then we get Exodus 32. Like that just, I don't know. For me, that blows my mind. But then it hurts my heart to know that if I'm not careful, I can fall into the exact same situation.
Yeah, because I mean, we think if I just knew, if God would just show me a miracle or something like that, then I wouldn't sin as much. Then this, it's like, well, I think our sin nature is a lot more powerful than we give credit for, because obviously they still make this major mistake. So
and I think about that right before we dive into the word. I think about that just in the sense of like, even when Jesus was walking on the earth, people saw the miracles, and yet I just read in the book of Mark this morning, they saw the miracles and attributed his work to Satan.
Right.
Is the Son of God, and they're like, it's Satan's work. And so it's one of those of like, man, like we do not want to get this wrong. We do not want to hit that moral failure.
Mm-hmm.
So take us on this journey, Matthew,
Yeah.
Exodus 32.
Yeah, so the it's really just the first 6 verses where you really see these I'm thinking of as warning signs.
Yeah.
Like you're driving on a road and there's a warning sign of sharp curve ahead, or be careful, there's often deer in the area or whatever. And so it's giving you a warning sign, or dead end or whatever. Like make sure you know what's coming up. And I see these as major warning signs. First one comes from verse 1, where it says, when the people saw that Moses delayed to come down from the mountain, the people gathered themselves together to Aaron and said, and then they start to say, make this golden calf for us. And the first thing that I was noticing here is the people gathering together. And so you've got a crowd forming, and people are starting to say, let's do this.
Yeah.
And so the warning sign that I think of is like, this is not always the case. It's not always this way. But one of the things that I've seen even in my own life is when everybody else is doing it.
Yep.
This said in verse 1, when the people gathered together. And so what's so interesting is that in verse 21 later, Aaron, the leader, because Moses is up on the mountain, right? So Aaron's in charge down below. And Aaron's the one that gets held responsible for this in verse 21. But it's because the people gathered together and started chanting, Aaron, Aaron.
Yeah.
It started
he
saying
starts
like,
believing his own stuff.
Yeah, like we've got a great idea for you. And it's not just one random guy. Like if just Jamie had walked up to Aaron, he would have been like, What? No, this is a dumb idea.
Yeah.
But everybody started to say this was a good idea. And the people demanded, Aaron, break the second commandment. That you shall not have any other gods. You shall not make a false image. But everybody wanted, and so eventually he made the bad choice.
Yeah, I think, man, it gives me Tower of Babel vibes from the book of Genesis.
Yeah, I mean, just a few pages earlier.
Yeah,
well, maybe more than a few, but
maybe like 100
maybe like 100, yeah.
The Tower of Babel, like, the people came together in the Tower of Babel and said, we're going to build a tower that rivals God. And they came together on that decision. The same thing here, man. This crowd of people's coming, and there's the idea of mob mentality. There's this idea of no one person is going to think to go and destroy their town or their community because something bad happens.
Right.
No individual person is going to be like, I'm going to bust this shop window and steal everything because the thing that I wanted didn't happen. But when you have hundreds of people, or you just have a group of people, you start getting caught in this think tank where that's the only thing that starts to make sense to you. I think this is what happens here. I think that's what happens in life when you start to be in a crowd of people that are constantly just amping you up, or constantly saying, Aaron, you're the man. Aaron, you got this. Aaron, we want you to make us an idol. Aaron, we don't know about God and Moses. We want you. Aaron, we want this calf. You start to believe it because you're stuck in that cycle. And so, man, I think like the first warning sign of be careful of the crowds. I think that's something that we forget.
Yeah, just identify that the echo chamber that you occupy
Yeah.
on social media or at your job or in your family or the people you hang around. Just it doesn't say it's bad and go be an
Yeah.
isolated monk somewhere.
Yeah,
but just be aware, be careful
It's not
of it.
saying you have to be completely, isolated on your own. Don't be around people.
Yeah,
It's not that. It's hey, when you're around people or crowds, when there's one overwhelming majority saying something,
right.
maybe take a second to think about it.
Yeah,
Maybe step back and say, is this right?
yep,
Is this really what I believe?
yeah,
But way before you jump in and go full head on with it, step back and say, wait, do I really think this?
yeah.
And so, yeah, I think that first warning sign.
First
just
warning
be,
sign's easy.
Be careful of the crowd.
Yeah,
Just know who's around.
what's
you.
everybody else saying to do? Well, just check. Just
check it.
check it against the Bible.
Yeah.
Pray about it.
Yeah.
Think about it. Just don't go head first because everybody else is doing it, right?
For them, they could have stepped back and said, wait a minute. The God who did all these things, all these miracles, saved us, took us out of slavery, gave us food when we had no idea what it was. He was providing it every single day. He said, don't have another God. Maybe I shouldn't do this.
Yeah, maybe this isn't the
Maybe
best
this
idea.
isn't the right idea.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
Just think about it.
Just think about it. Be careful of the crowd. But Matthew, give us the next one.
Yeah, the
Continue
second
on.
one keeps coming from verse 1. We don't even have to finish verse 1. Just the very first part of it, it says, when the people saw that Moses delayed. So before they gathered themselves together, what happened was they saw Moses had delayed to come down from the mountain.
Yeah.
To put it in more modern terms, he wasn't on their timeline.
Yeah.
And so they wanted Moses to hurry up. They're like, man, this has been their leader, right? This has been their guy that it's him and his staff that they've seen be the ones that God is working through. And so Moses disappears and he's gone for a while and he delays. It takes him a while to come down the mountain. They're starting to get impatient. And this unknown, this time of waiting led them into going, well, maybe we need to do something for ourselves. Maybe who knows what's going on with Moses. Let's you and I figure something out. And so they abandoned the leader that God had for them and the God of the leader that God had for them, all because they started to get impatient in the waiting and in the unknown, that they weren't sure what was going on up there. They could just see the smoke and the fire and the flames. And they're like, well, is Moses up there? How is he surviving? Is he dead? Like, maybe it's time for us to
down to eat.
Right, maybe it's time for us to take this matter into our own hands. So I think that's the second warning sign, is being cautious, watching out for those times of unknown, those times of waiting, those times when you're kind of in limbo, and impatience can start to creep in.
Yeah, I think there's the old saying of idle hands are the devil's work.
Yep.
Or the devil's workshop. Like, when we are so impatient and we want things on our timeline and our schedule and we want things to happen now. Like, I've talked about this so many times. Amazon has spoiled us as people, because it used to be when I was a kid, you'd order something, you waited 7, 10, 15 days, and then it would show up in the mail.
Mm-hmm.
Now I order it, it's here in 2 days. It's on my timeline.
Right.
I need something. If I need it on Saturday, I can wait until Thursday to order it when it's more convenient for me to order then, because I know it'll be there.
Mm-hmm.
But then what happens is we start to do that with God, and we start to say, hey, like, we need this now. Like, we want it on our timeline. And when it doesn't come, that's when we start to step up, and that's when we start to let doubts and sin creep in. The people of Israel started doubting, like, is Moses even alive?
Yeah.
Because he was on the mountain. It was 40 days, I think, on the mountaintop. Fact check me.
Community
in the comments.
Notes. I think it was.
I think it was 40 days and 40 nights. Moses was on the top of the mountain by himself with God. And so the people are probably sitting there like, he's dead. He's not back yet. He hasn't ate. Like, 40 days. There's no food on top of that mountain. There's fire. All we see is fire. He's not here. And they start to get impatient.
Mm-hmm.
So, man, I think that's such a big warning sign we need to go against.
And I think before we go to the third one, it's good to stop here and say, hey, let's just make sure we're realizing that the first two things aren't sins in and of themselves.
Yeah.
It's not wrong to go with the crowd. Or do what everybody else is saying. Because what if everybody else is saying, hey, let's worship the Lord and pray and fast and read our Bibles? Like, well, okay, do what they're doing. Like, that's a good thing.
Yeah, that was something
and
like...
same with the second one. Just because it's taken a while, that doesn't mean it's a sin. That's okay. It's
just
okay.
because it's not on our timeline,
Right.
it's not a bad thing. Like at church, we did 21 days of prayer.
Yeah.
We were challenging everyone, join us as we pray for 21 days. Join us. Like, let's do this together. That's crowd mentality,
Right.
but that's not
in
a bad
good
thing.
way. Yeah.
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 And so these aren't sins. These are the signs that
Right.
can lead you.
Right. It's kind of the flashing lights, like,
Yeah.
hey, check engine light. Something
Yeah.
could be coming up that's a problem. So anyways, the third one is kind of where there's a shift from these are only warning signs to now the warning signs are smaller sins that are leading to something big. So
It's starting to get dangerous.
yeah, you're starting to get closer to the cliff. Here's verse 2. Aaron said to them, "Take off the rings of gold that are in the ears of your wives, your sons, and your daughters, and bring them to me." So all the people took off the rings of gold that were in their ears and brought them to Aaron. And so this is the gold jewelry
Yeah.
that they had gotten from the Egyptians when they left Egypt back many, many chapters earlier.
Yeah.
And so God said, we're going to get all this gold and all this stuff from the Egyptians on your way out. And then that's going to be the gold that is used in the construction of the Ark of the Covenant and the tabernacle, all these things that were for worship and service of God.
Yeah.
And it was all supplied by the Egyptians on their way out of Egypt, which is
then all supplied by God.
Right.
Like-
And so it's just like this radical stuff. And then Aaron says, now, well, so you want me to do this? Well, where are we going to get the gold? Oh, well, why don't you get the stuff some of the stuff that the Egyptians gave you?
Yeah.
And so they taken off their jewelry and things like that. So what's happening, the warning sign in all of this is that they're using God's gifts for ungodly things or for their own gain or for their own ideas. Is they're using the things that God had given them for godly purposes and instead using it for something else. They're saying, God gave us this jewelry, and instead we're going to use it to construct a golden calf. God's given us this, God's provided us this, and we're going to use it in an ungodly way. And this happens way more to us than just gold or jewelry or money. It could be a time, it could be something that we're good at and gifted at. It could be all sorts of things that God has given us that are good and to be used for God glorifying ends that we instead just co-opt for ourselves and use it selfishly or in ungodly ways. And that's not only is that a sin in and of itself, but it's a warning sign of, hey, if we're starting to take things that God's given us for his purposes and then use them for our own, and we're no longer dedicating those things to the Lord, then something big might be on the way. Some big mistake is coming up.
Yeah, I think about the idea when we talk about like using God's giftings, for ourselves in that sense, right? I think about it big time in like artists and musicians and really creative, high-level creative people. There is multiple, like I know of many different bands that are considered secular bands that their members are Christian.
Yeah.
They follow Jesus, but they're making secular music. And it's like, I don't know, in my mind, that blows my mind. And again, I'm a pastor, so, it's a little like I'm thinking about it in terms of how, like every gift that I have, I need to turn around and give it to God. Like my testimony, like every time I try to do things on my own, God calls something. I had a knee surgery and a shoulder surgery that I believe are two moments where God was chasing me down and I was running. But like I'm looking.
So he took out your knee.
So he took out my knee, yeah. And so I'm looking and I'm like, man, like if I had this musical ability, like what would it look like to give that to God instead? And so I think it's sinful to take God's giftings and use it for ourselves.
Yeah.
That in itself is sin. But that's one of those warning signs of when that's something that's happening, that starts to creep in and that can cause us to go down that trail of
that sort of
this
self-centered,
failure.
like I'm not thinking through a godly lens anymore. It doesn't mean that that's always bad to do something, with your talents or your time or your money that's not completely like, oh, well, I spent money on food today, but that wasn't missions. Is that okay? Like we're not trying to get all, into the weeds on this stuff. It's just, all right, this is one more sign to help us be cautious. I thought what was interesting about this is that their sin here and this demand for contributing came before God ever said, let's use this gold for the tabernacle.
Yeah.
And so like it kind of goes back to being careful of the crowd, and that just because it's loud and demanding doesn't mean it's from God. And a lot of times we see like something really loud, something really demanding of our attention, something that gets repeated over and over, and we think, oh, God's trying to teach me something.
God's trying to show me something. He's
and
trying
he
to
might
lead
be.
me something.
He might be.
Yeah.
But we can't just assume that, because right here, like Aaron could have been like, oh, well, this is the people of God.
Yeah.
And all the people are wanting me to do this. This must be from God.
This must be from
and
God.
Clearly it was not.
Yeah, definitely.
So anyways, that was a long time spent on the third one. Fourth one comes from verse 4 and 5, where right after this, they take off the rings, take off the gold jewelry. The big deal happens, verse 4. He received the gold from their hand and fashioned it with a graving tool and made a golden calf.
Yeah.
And they said, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt." When Aaron saw this, he built an altar before it, and Aaron made a proclamation and said, "Tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord." So what's so crazy is I used to think they were worshiping a bull, or worshiping a calf, a cow of some sort, and saying that a cow brought you out of Egypt. But what they're saying is this is a representation of the God. It's a breaking of the second second commandment of you shall not make any image of me. Meaning it's not that you're worshiping another God. You're trying to worship God through a physical representation. That was the big problem, because he uses the word in verse 5, the covenantal name of God. It's in all caps in my Bible, Yahweh. So they're trying to worship the one true God, but they're doing it in the wrong way. I think it's because they wanted this physical representation. They can't see Moses anymore.
Yeah.
They've all the smoke and the fire, that's old news. It's been a month. It's been a month. Like, that's cool until you're a month in and you've seen it literally all day, every day, day and night. Plus, they'd seen the pillar of cloud and fire guiding them around the wilderness for a long time too. So like, to us, that's radical. To them at this point, it's old news.
That's an average Tuesday.
Exactly. It sounds so crazy to say that, but it was for them at this point. And so they want something else. They want a physical representation. They want an image. They want something that they can look to. And as I was thinking about this, I think for us as Christians, we're not in the same boat, but the same sort of thing happens in that we rely on our physical experiences way too often. Yeah. We can be I've got to feel God. If I'm in church and I'm not getting goosebumps, then it wasn't a good Sunday. It wasn't God. Then so that song, I didn't like it because it didn't give me goosebumps, or it didn't make me want to raise my hand. And so therefore, we want the physical representation, especially because of the culture we live in too. But we want that physical experience, and that's not wrong always. No. But if that's what we're relying on, if we're depending on the experiencing of something, that's when there's a big problem.
That makes me think of like doing student ministry. There's this talk. I do the students at the North Campus. You've done student ministry at South Fork before you become North Campus pastor. There's that idea of the spiritual mountaintop.
Yeah.
So like in December, we took our students to the Extreme Conference. It's in Gatlinburg, Tennessee. Hundreds and thousands of students are there. Dynamic speakers, amazing artists, lighting and setup, and huge LED screens.
Tons of fun,
all the fun, and they get on the spiritual mountaintop. But then guess what happens? You come home. And now the God that you are worshiping, he's the same God when you come home and you're at church on a Sunday and you have a singer and a guitar player.
Right.
He's the same God when you have the pastor standing up sharing a message and he's just preaching straight from the word, and he's not as dynamic as a Zane Black or whoever else was there.
Who Zane Black is, but whoever it is, I'm sure he's good. Yeah.
Not as dynamic as him, or it's not, the lighting's not the same. We don't have the big LED screens.
Right.
It's the same God though.
Mm-hmm.
And so what happens is when we start to allow our spiritual life to be dictated just by the things that we see, just by the service, that spiritual mountaintop, just by I can only experience God when I have the Starbucks coffee in one hand and my ESV journaling Bible in the other hand. God's not there if I don't have those two things.
Right.
That's when we start to miss it, because he's the same God.
Yeah. And so the main warning sign there is just don't be too dependent on physical things.
Yeah.
We've got to be willing to love and ask, hey, God, I would love for you to speak to me audibly, like where I can hear, or, this miraculous thing that you might do, by healing someone or something. And those are fine to ask for, good to ask for, but we can't be dependent on those and be willing to say, I'm going to rely instead on God's word and the basics. And so anyways, that's number 4. Fifth warning sign also comes from right after that in verse 5. Verse 5 and 6, it says, when Aaron saw this, he built an altar, made a proclamation, and we just read this, but I want to read it again because of what he says. He says, tomorrow shall be a feast to the Lord. The people had just yelled out, these are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of Egypt. And Aaron, I think at this point, his eyes are like, whoa, why is there a plural on there?
Yeah.
Why is that a little g?
Yeah.
Like, it shouldn't be gods. And so he's like, tomorrow, we're going to have a bigger feast, a bigger celebration to the one true God, to the Lord. And he uses his covenantal name, Yahweh, there. And so then verse 6, it says what they did. They rose up early the next day, they offered burnt offerings and brought peace offerings. Yeah. And so it's like they're doing things that God had prescribed for worship. Which is just so weird that Aaron it's almost as if he's realizing at that moment, oh no, we just made a big mistake. Yeah. So the fifth and the final warning sign for us before one of these big life-changing failures is when you start to rationalize partial obedience. And what we mean by that is what happened to Aaron when he started to say, oh, well, if we make this dedicate this to the Lord, then it's going to be okay. And you start to rationalize, like, well, we're still worshiping. Yeah. Because he knew, as the people knew, that they had been sent out of Egypt to worship God. That's all throughout the beginning of Exodus when Moses is talking to Pharaoh. And he says, send us out so that we can have a feast to the Lord. And that's what they do right here in verse 6. They have a feast to the Lord. Yeah. And it's like, okay, so we're doing it right now. And he's just rationalizing partial obedience because Aaron's only half right here. Yeah. He is worshiping, in the one true God in the sense that he's saying we're worshiping the right who, but he doesn't have the how right at all. He's like, yes, it's God. Or maybe, for us, it's Jesus.
It's Jesus.
But it's not the right how. It's the right who, but it's not the right how. And so he's rationalizing that partial bit of obedience.
Yeah, and I think partial obedience is maybe one of the hardest things in our culture. I think it's something that we see all the time, where it's like, man, I love Jesus. Like, Jesus saved me. Jesus changed my life. But, like, do I really have to give to the church? Yeah. Do I really need to serve? And, like, it's football Sunday. Like, the boys are coming over. Like, do I really need to go? Like, Jesus changed my life, man. I love him. I'm going to follow him. Do I really need to wake up and read my Bible every day? Yeah. It's that partial obedience where it's like, man, you love God and he changed your life and you're following him, but do I really need to do this? Or maybe you're not doing it, but you're like, you know what? God loves me. And so I know that he loves me. So even though there's some disobedience here, like I know God knows me. Like, I can ask for repentance on Sunday for what I'm doing on Saturday because, God loves me. And it's that partial obedience that I think leads us down that final rail. I think when we look at these warning signs, I think each one of them starts to build off of themselves, where the crowd is coming and you start to surround yourself with the wrong people and you start to hear the wrong things. You start getting in that think tank.
Listening to the wrong voices. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I think you go from there to, man, the timing's just not whatever you've been praying for or wanting or seeking. Like, it just hasn't happened yet.
It's delayed. Too long.
It's taking too long. We want that now, man. And it's not here. And then because it's not here and because we're surrounded by the crowd, man, that next step, that next sign, you're driving down the interstate, man, here's that sign. Here's that sign. The third sign, you start using your own gifts for yourself. You're trying to make it happen. It's not working. I'm trying to make it happen.
I'll force it.
I'll force it. Yeah. I'll grind culture. Nose to the grindstone.
I'll do it my way and ask God to bless it. That's what I'll do.
I'm going to do it the way I want to do it. So then the next one is we start to depend on that because it's that next sign. We start to depend on it. It's not working. God's delayed. The crowd's saying, do it. I'm doing it. And now you get stuck on it. And that's the only thing you can do.
It's all about the physical.
It's all about
what
that.
You can see. Yep.
And then it leads us to the last point where after we've done all of that, we get to the end and we start to rationalize it and say, well, I'm obeying God doing this. Like, the crowd's telling me to do it. The signs are here. Like, I started obeying God. And you start to rationalize this.
We're just dedicated to the Lord, just dedicated to the Lord, and we'll be good,
Yeah.
And,
as long as I say in Jesus' name at the end.
Yeah.
Like,
as long as I pray before it, it's fine.
And so I think that's where that fear is. And so we hit that, and we have that's when that moral failure sits in. That's where not that small sin, God sees all sin as the same. All sin is sin. All sin equals death and separation from God. But the sin, the moral failures that we're talking about, every sin has a consequence spiritually of the same, but not every sin has the same consequence earthly.
Mm-hmm.
I can tell a lie, and there may be no earthly consequences to you. Like, I can sit here and look you in the face and be like, this shirt's white.
Yeah.
You know it's not. I know it's not. I'm telling a lie. There's no consequence to that. But if I go and kill somebody,
there's going to be some earthly consequences. Yeah.
To God, they're the same.
Mm-hmm.
But there's consequences for one. So in the last minute, I think, man, if you're one of those people where those warning signs are popping up, you're one of those people where you are seeing this happen. Mm-hmm. You are noticing, maybe you're just at the first warning sign, or maybe you're at like the fourth or the fifth warning sign. Man, I challenge you, turn from it. Go back to God. I think when that happens, man, we need to remember who God is. Remember what he's done. Remind yourself of the gospel and turn from it.
Yeah, I mean, he's putting those warning signs there as a part of his grace to be what turns you around. He's not putting that there to condemn you. He's putting that sign there to say, hey, time to turn, time to repent, time to confess that, time to come back to me. Not like shame on you, but instead like this is another chance for you to turn around before you run off that cliff.
Like this is your second chance. This is your third chance. This is your fourth chance. This is your fifth chance. And what I love about God is when we commit those moral failures, God's gracious.
Yeah.
He still offers forgiveness. He still offers salvation. But there's that penalty. There's that issue. There's that hardship. Because of this sin, all the nation, all the generation was not allowed to go into the promised land. The next generation could.
They're just compounding error on top of error later.
Error on top of error on top of error.
Yeah.
And so there's still that penalty. God still loves his people. God still forgives his people. But man, if you're one of those people and you feel those warning signs, you start to see them. That's God trying to get your attention, saying, hey, come back. Hey, turn and come back. Mm-hmm. And so, man, I'm so challenged by this personally, of when I'm thinking through my life, what warning signs am I hitting? And so if you're watching this podcast and you feel like those warning signs have been popping up in your life, I encourage you, to turn and run to God, and then seek out somebody. Whether it's a pastor, me, Matthew, one of the pastors at REVO, maybe it's a friend that loves Jesus and they do, or whoever it may be, reach out to someone, because, man, we're not meant to do life alone. We're not meant to struggle alone, and God's given us these warning signs so that we can flee it. But Matthew, thanks for being on here.
Man.
I think this was such an impactful time.
Yeah.
And so I'm happy you joined us today. This is the REVO Church Podcast. We'll see you next time. Peace.